Top 12 underrated, hilarious, and absurd Batman villains that could be extremely deadly. A superhero is only as good as the supervillains that they fight. Sure, comic book publishers could get away with things like introducing goofy, one-off villains and forgetting about them in the following issue back in the golden age of comics, but things work differently these days.
We're a talented group. If we work together, we can escape.
We, as the audience, want to invest in our characters, no matter how honorable or evil they might be, which is why we say that a superhero is only as good as the supervillains they fight, and going by that logic, it is actually insane how Batman himself hasn't gone insane, considering just how many murderous psychopaths populate his fabled rogues gallery.
You haven't won yet, Batman.
So many iconic supervillains with tragic yet completely horrifying backstories exist for these characters that HBO Max is dedicating an entire TV series to just Arkham Asylum. Mr. Freeze, the Penguin, Bane, Killer Croc, Carmine Falcone, Two-Face. Batman has gone up against a litany of evil geniuses and brutes in Croc and Bane's case and come out on top every time. Even the Joker has died at least once trying to kill his precious bats, and let's just say it didn't end well for either party involved, but that's the cream of the crop.
Batman? I know you're up there. Oh, there you are.
Batman is notorious for being a street-level operative with a god-level intellect. He has fought way more villains than we could ever imagine. And so, naturally, there is an entire host of wild and absurd supervillains in this rogues gallery whose villainy is based on a premise so unrelentingly bewildering that it unexpectedly induces hilarity.
Here! Tenai, catch. What? My eyes!
But make no mistake, these D-list comical villains are just as deadly as their A-list counterparts, and some of them can even make the Joker look sane. So, without further ado, here are 12 underrated and absurd Batman villains who are just as hilarious as they are deadly. But before we get into our explanation, we do have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means quite a lot.
Freaking cats.
What the? Professor Pig. This character is the stuff of George Orwell's nightmares. Imagine a person who wears a literal pig mask to commit acts of crime. Samuel Tarly's nickname of Sir Piggy feels like an attack, but it fits perfectly for Professor Pig, especially if you're a fan of the Gotham TV show.
Jim, ruin everything.
In that series, Pig is a ruthless serial killer whose garb is sure to win him the best costume award at any Halloween party. Just look at that fleshy monstrosity of a head mask. And that one scene where Pig turns up wearing an immaculate chef's coat wielding a butcher's knife is firing off all sorts of pork and bacon jokes in our head. But now that we've taken a look at the crispy and admittedly comical outer skin of Professor Pig, it's time to descend into the belly of the beast and figure out why his creator Grant Morrison called him one of the weirdest, most insane characters that have ever been in Batman when the Joker is right there. Debuting in Batman number 666 in a non-canonical future world where Damian Wayne is Batman, Professor Pig was introduced as one of the 5 crime bosses of that Gotham City.
Sorry, old chap. Fresh out. Looks like that leg is going to have to come off.
In his debut appearance, the Professor isn't wearing his signature mask. Instead, his face's natural shape uncannily resembles that of a pig. We would honestly have been happy if DC had left it at that and never visited him again because of his actual backstory is all kinds of messed up. Laszlo Valentin was once an agent of the covert UN organization Spiral and was responsible for designing neo-pharmaceutical products such as the mind-eroding gas compound which was used by the crazed Dr. Daedalus in his final confrontation with Batman. While under the employ of Spiral, Laszlo was subjected to that very compound he created and forced into a labyrinth under his mind-warping effects. By Valentin's own admission, the only exit was via violent paranoid schizophrenia, drug abuse, and DIY surgery. After subjecting himself to these horrors, Laszlo Valentin emerged from the labyrinth as Professor Pig, the Pygmalion-obsessed mad surgeon whose only goal in life was to create perfection. To this end, he kidnapped, mutilated, and entranced several innocent people, transforming them into Dollatrons, human beings that resembled Cupid dolls and were completely subservient to Laszlo's every whim. Morrison acknowledged the fact that Batman has an overabundance of crazy characters in his rogues gallery, but called Professor Pig different in that he was so disturbed and disconnected that his very presence was disconcerting.
Mr. Toad. Guess
Pig doesn't have a superpower. If anything, his skills as a surgeon and master sculptor are all the assets left to him, with even his insanity being questionable at the best of times. But anyone who thinks pain is just the beginning of perfection is certified deadly in our books. Laszlo Valentin's experiments can only be described as perhaps the most depraved human experimentation project since MK Ultra, and if you know anything about that, then you know why we call this pig lethal. During the events of the Year of the Pig storyline, Laszlo manages to kidnap Robin and bring him to his lair to transform him into the ultimate Dollatron, but is foiled, as always, by Batman. He remains active in Gotham City alongside his troupe of equally demented performers from the Circus of Strange, and has even worked for and alongside bigger hitters like Talia al Ghul, aka his Mother of Nails, and Bane, though he wasn't given much of an option with the latter. He was forced to work for the mercenary even with a broken arm. Professor Pig is the embodiment of bizarre, underrated, and outright crazy in a single character, and he milks his worth in every panel he appears on.
Just look at all that ice. Touch it and you'll be looking at 10 years in Blackgate Prison.
Ten-Eyed Man. Nope, not kidding you. This supervillain's gimmick is that instead of the regular pair of eyes that a normal person has, he's got 10, granting him 360-degree vision. It's just that the way in which he acquires his superpower has to be the most unintentionally hilarious origin story for a supervillain ever. And we are counting every character that features on this list whilst making that claim too. With a name like Ten-Eyed Man, you'd think that that would be a literal thing, as in this person actually had 10 eyes strewn across his body, which isn't something new. Danzo Shimura had 10 Sharingan implanted in one arm, or at the very least he'd have equipment that gave him that field of vision, allowing for enhanced combat skills. Alas, this here character was created during the peak of the Silver Age of comics, and you know what that means. His backstory is about to get real weird, real quick.
Oh, Batman! According to Who's Who, the Ten-Eyed Man, aka Philip Reardon, was a soldier in the Special Force.
Philip Reardon was a US Special Forces veteran who had served during the Vietnam War. Nearly every new comic book character or storyline conceived during the late 60s and early 70s had some connection to the US's greatest modern military disaster, because of course it did. Now, old Philip here was a decent enough soldier, but he became a legend because of a grenade explosion that left him with a permanent indentation squarely in the middle of his forehead, earning him the nickname Three-Eyed Reardon, which we can't imagine being a good look for him, especially with the ladies. But anyway, after returning from the war, he, like many Vietnam veterans, would gain employment in a law enforcement capacity, though probably not at the scale you're imagining. He got a job as a security guard for a warehouse. Go figure, eh? Despite this, Philip was committed to doing his job, managing to convince a group of thugs that he had eyes on the back of his head, thanks to a well-concealed pocket mirror when they tried to rob his warehouse's vault. So they decided to blind him in every possible way, battering him and leaving him disoriented with partial visual impairment, which would blow up in full-scale blindness when Reardon goes to the vault to try and stop the robbers and catches the vault explosion right to his face. Thanks to this brain already being scrambled like so many eggs, he incorrectly assumes that Batman, who would arrive on the scene to stop the robbers, is the culprit of his grave injury and vows revenge against the Dark Knight. Thanks to the efforts of an underworld doctor known only as Engstrom, Reardon was selected as a subject for radical experimental surgery that promised to restore his sight better than before, but neither Phil nor you, our dear viewers, are ready for what he did next. You'd assume that he would replace Reardon's eyeballs with some kind of crazy technology or something, right? Well, Engstrom, the mad lad, only went and reconfigured the neurons in Philip Reardon's fingers to allow them to function as both his appendages and, drumroll please, his eyes.
Attached his optic nerves to his fingertips, and Reardon became the Ten-Eyed.
That's right, the Ten-Eyed Man doesn't see through eyes, he sees through his fingers, which have somehow gained the function of his optic nerves as well. Now, we know what you're thinking. A, that's gross. B, it's also stupid. And C, does he have eyeballs at his fingertips? The answers are yes, yes, and no. Thankfully, though, they do effectively function as his eyes, giving him that 360-degree field of vision we were talking about earlier. If you can't tell by now, the Ten-Eyed Man is an obvious joke character. The guy literally goes blind if he catches things with his hands, for Christ's sake. But that doesn't make him less deadly. His enhanced field of vision coupled with his war veteran status does make him a rather effective low-tier villain. In fact, during his first fight with the Dark Knight, he manages to defeat him by breaking down the fake vision apparatus that Alfred had helped him cook up. Everything from that point onwards, though, has been one hilariously tragic downward spiral for the Vietnam hero. If you truly want to understand just how hilariously non-effective Ten-Eyed Man's powers are, Just watch the A Bat Divided episode from the classic Batman the Brave and the Bold animated series. You'll see what we mean.
Now I can wipe you out with a mere thought.
Crazy Quilt. Okay, we've covered some exceptionally weird Batman villains here at Marvelous Videos. There's the date-obsessed Calendar Man, who becomes a much more cerebral character over the years thanks to many great writers taking an interest in him. There's Ragdoll, a comedic Chucky-type character originally that became a pop culture sensation thanks to CW's The Flash. And then there's this crazy guy who was literally obsessed with colors and quilting.
The world is my canvas, and you'll be my paint.
No wonder he's called Crazy Quilt. Created by the legendary Jack Kirby during his brief stint at DC, Crazy Quilt was an exceptionally talented painter who led a double life as a criminal mastermind, using paintings to leave clues for his henchmen to follow up on and execute crimes without directly implicating himself. He was living a comfortable life as a wealthy art thief until he was double-crossed by one of his own henchmen, tearing down his modest empire. To make matters worse, in the ensuing struggle between the authorities and his gang, a gunshot wound severely damaged his eyesight, effectively blinding him. He volunteered for experimental procedure that turned his fingertips into eyes. No, I'm just kidding. No, he actually returned his lost vision by fusing a unique helmet directly to his optic nerves. While the operation itself was successful, Quilt was left with a unique form of color blindness. Though his sight was restored, he could only see the world in bright, vivid colors. This constant sensory overload drove him insane, and he assumed the costume identity of the supervillain we now know as Crazy Quilt.
A good likeness, don't you think? Without sight, I'm forced to be a little more creative.
Though he doesn't have any innate superpowers, his helmet visor more than compensates for that fact. Crazy Quilt's helmet allows him to hypnotize his victims using flashing lights of various colors, and can also project lethal laser beams as well as blinding getaway lights to facilitate an easy escape. The visor functions as Quilt's artificial eyes since his own eyes no longer function. The lenses feed their input signal straight into his brain, and he can see things even if the visor is placed on the back of his head. After being defeated repeatedly by the Boy Commandos, also created by Kirby for DC following up on the success of Captain America, he relocates to Gotham City and develops an impassioned hatred for the Boy Wonder after being foiled by Batman and Robin in his early ventures. Though the dynamic duo was operating as a team, it was Robin whose actions directly led to his downfall. This led to Crazy Quilt developing an impassioned hatred for the Boy Wonder, making him more of a Robin villain than a Batman villain. Indeed, so strong was Crazy Quilt's obsession with ending the Boy Wonder that he nearly pummeled Jason Todd to death and a day into the latter's tenure as the new Robin, thinking that it was Dick Grayson under the mask. He continues to harass the Bat family to this day with his avant-garde costume, his crazy powerful helmet, and his gang of modest yet artisanal thugs.
Crazy one.
I am.
Polka-Dot Man. Man, hats off to David Dastmalchian for pulling off such a bizarrely comical character with his signature aloofness. But the fact that the Suicide Squad 2021's Polka-Dot Man has superpowers and intense mommy issues is something that James Gunn and his creative team came up with. And while we agreed that it adds personality to what is an objectively circus-like character, it kind of takes away from the fact that Polka-Dot Man is supposed to be taken as something of an inverse meta-joke by us, the audience, as well. Because any character that thinks "stay away" or "dots all she wrote" while wielding a baseball bat and dressed up in a multicolored polka dot leotard is intimidating has to be either joking or crazier than the Joker. We lean towards the former, but the latter isn't a far-fetched possibility either.
What's that around his neck?
A power dampener. They call him the Polka-Dot Man.
Debuting in Detective Comics issue 300, it's evident that Bill Finger created this character to get out all of his on-the-dot puns and jokes out of his system. Because if you read the issue itself, you would be surprised at the number of puns Batman himself cracks during the entirety of its length. The dynamic duo had been called into the Spot Carpet Cleaning Company, whose tagline we assume was, "We'll make 'em spotless." If it wasn't, well, that's just a shame. When Batman and Robin arrived on the scene, they were greeted by a most peculiar sight. Two rather normal-looking thugs were trying to break into the company's primary vault to carry out what was a blatant robbery, but there was a third man amongst them who looked like he'd lost his way home from the circus. That man would be Abner Krill, the costume nuisance who started off his criminal career as Mr. Polka-Dot. After declaring his intentions to make his name known throughout the underworld, Krill proceeds to show off the features of his costume, which he believes will be his ticket to fame, once he takes out Batman, of course. And to be completely fair to Abner, his costume is a work of mechanical genius. Every polka dot dot on his costume remained inert as long as it was attached, but once detached, could be utilized in 100 different ways, all controlled by complex electrical relays in the suit itself, and none of which was known to his enemies. Polka-Dot Man had such dangerous weapons as a buzzsaw dot, which is exactly what it sounds like, a sun dot, which could project blinding lights, and a flying saucer dot, which performs just as advertised. Even his grand plan was polka-dot based, as Batman figured out that his hideout was likely the head of a massive dot-connected man that ran across Gotham City in the form of locations of Polka-Dot Man's crimes. Dick Grayson, the first Boy Wonder, infamously used a tracking leotard, yes, it's a real thing, check it out, to bring Krill to justice, a fact that has been made the butt of the joke of the supervillain community, usually the feline kind. After that, he vanished into obscurity and ended up in Batman's Bureau of Missing Villains before resurfacing sporadically to team up with the D-list villains on his scale, like Condiment King. Polka-Dot Man was ruthlessly murdered by the Human Flame when he went on a rampage, but has made appearances primarily as part of Task Force X since then, being brought back to life thanks to DC's reboot Happy Triggerfinger. 2021's The Suicide Squad makes him a metahuman, turning his polka dots into shape-shifting gadgets rather than electronic gizmos, which kind of takes away from his comic book credibility. Not to mention the fact that his death was the equivalent of what his Peacemaker co-star would call a cheap pop for the audience. But overall, Polka-Dot Man will be fondly remembered as a byproduct of a bygone era, given a new, if short, lease on life by the comedic genius of James Gunn and co.
Shave a bone off their nose, slit their eyelids open, stab needles into their lips.
Duela Dent, the Joker's daughter. Any character that claims to be the daughter of the Clown Prince of Crime, let alone actually being that, has to have a couple of screw loose in their head. And once you've taken stock of the Joker's daughter, you'll realize that she doesn't have a couple of screws loose, they're missing from her head altogether. Initially, we didn't even know whose daughter she was, because she claimed that she was the following people: Catgirl, the daughter of Catwoman; Scarecrow, the daughter of Scarecrow; Riddler's daughter; Penguin's daughter. Basically, think of every iconic Batman villain from the 70s, and she claimed parentage from them.
Duela, stop, please. Let me down. I'm helping you, Veronica.
Eventually, she said that Harvey Dent was her dad and he abandoned her and her mother because she wasn't born in a pair, and that her name was Duela Dent, but Nightwing is able to deduce that even this is a lie given how old she was around the time of Donna Troy's wedding. Even though her parentage remained shrouded in mystery for nearly 30 years, she solidified herself as being the Joker's daughter, both in spirit and later in actuality through her actions. How? Well, firstly, she loved getting violent like her dad and was not afraid to show it, even sporting a face that looked like his, albeit her locks looked like they'd been shocked to make them spikier. And then during the events of 2007's Countdown Presents The Search for Ray Palmer Crime Society, which sets up the final crisis, it is revealed that Duela Dent is in fact the Joker's daughter. She's just not from this Earth. On Earth 3, where Crime Syndicate of America resides, the Joker's heroic counterpart, the Jokester, has an affair with the Three-Face aka Evelyn Dent and sires a child with her without his knowledge. This child is then raised by her stepfather, the Riddler, and becomes a part of the Riddler family, Earth 3's primary team of superheroes. Confused yet? Well, we're just getting started. Thanks to the spatial and temporal anomalies caused by the multiple crisis events that have occurred throughout DC, somehow Duela's soul has been able to bump around her various multiversal selves, till it finally came into the main continuity and went insane like her father's evil counterpart. As crazy as all this might be, the New 52 managed to make her even crazier. In this rebooted version of the Joker's daughter, Duela Dent is born psychotic, with her parents being openly scared of what they'd created. The child would make corsets out of barbed wire, bed mobiles out of knives, and was even found giving herself the faceless men treatment once by her parents, after which they decided that they had to get rid of her, and she ran away from home upon finding this out. She escaped to Gotham City sewers, where she came upon the Joker's face and found the power of his presence it gave her so intoxicating that she decided to make him her father. She orchestrated a series of devastating crimes across the entire city to lure out Dollmaker, the very man who had performed the facial reconstruction surgery per Joker's request. Duela makes him graft Joker's face onto her own and then injects herself with her father's blood to complete her transformation into the Joker's daughter. This is a decidedly darker iteration of the character, as you can tell, and Duela Dent herself remains one of the most violently entertaining enigmas of the Batman Rogues gallery.
Kite for my fiendish revenge. I'll be the most famous kite-related person in history.
Kite Man. At this point, you're probably thinking, man, they can make a Batman villain out of just anything, and you're not far off. Do you know how we just referenced all those novelty characters in our previous entry? Do check them out, by the way. Their origins are more horrifying than anything you can imagine. Well, this character is just like them, but he is so much more. And by that, we mean so much more of a joke that he is the literal punchline of Batman Rogues Gallery. Imagine a guy so pumped up by his love of kites, hang gliders, and hang gliding in general that he decides to make a criminal career out of it. Well, luckily for you, and unluckily for us, you don't have to, because that's exactly what Charlie Brown is. And by that I mean Charles Brown, aka Chuck. Out of the cavalcade of bizarre oddities that exist in the rogues galleries of DC superheroes, perhaps none is as brave or stupid as Kite Man, the fact that was ridiculed to the point of becoming stale during the War of Jokes and Riddles storyline. After all, who can take a character that flies around on a jumbo hang glider, uses kite-themed paraphernalia, and shouts out, "Hell yeah!" for no apparent reason with an ounce of seriousness? Debuting in Batman number 133 and created by Bill Finger and Dick Sprang, nothing was explained about Brown's infatuation with kites for several decades aside from the fact that he was really into them as a child. In fact, even his name wasn't revealed until 1986's Hawkman Volume 2 Issue 4 was published, a full 26 years after Kite Man's first appearance. All that was known about him was the fact that he was a joke in both the superhero and the supervillain communities.
What's the point of making a resi here, bro? I mean, I took my lady out tonight so we could see and be seen.
No, it's fine.
In 2016's Rebirth event rebooted the entire DCU and finally gave us an answer as to why Kite Man does what he does, and it was more tragic than we could have expected. In Batman Volume 3, number 27, it was revealed that Chuck was a former aerodynamic engineer who was responsible for creating the Joker-mobile. Chuck had a son who thought his dad's obsession with kites was cool, and one time he even explained "hell yeah" at the sight of his father with a kite. When the Riddler killed his son by poisoning his kite string, Chuck decided to create a customized glider and, adopting his son's words as his villainous catchphrase, became the Kite Man. He joined the Joker side during the war and was essentially comic relief throughout the arc, eventually siding with the Caped Crusader against both parties involved. Kite Man provided the kites that Riddler's team used to invade Joker's secret location, and it was his kites that helped clean them up as well, thanks to a little help from Alfred and the Bat Blimp. Kite Man isn't an inherently evil person. He is just as he appears to be, a goofball character whose kite-inspired gimmick forced Batman to fly the rarely glimpsed Bat-Kite on a couple of occasions. But with the layers that his character has received as of DC Rebirth, Kite Man has become one of the more tragic supervillain characters in the D-list of Batman's rogues gallery. Not to mention that he was killed and eaten by the ruthless intergang boss Bruno Ugly Mannheim before Rebirth brought him back. So, you know, Kite Man, hell yeah!
Hey, big fella. Did Killer Moth create you in a lab? Yes, he did. Yes.
Killer Moth. Imagine a version of Batman that had no moral compass, consorted with supervillains, and was so laughably terrible at his job that even his peers didn't take him seriously. Now, imagine his costume was green and purple, with a bright orange cape and literal moth mask. That's the kind of criminal that original Killer Moth was. And when your own henchmen don't take you seriously, that's the sign of a truly comical meta-existence. The OG Killer Moth was a prisoner identified only by his prison number, 234026. While in prison, he reads a newspaper article about Batman and becomes obsessed with him, scouring every piece of information he can get about Gotham's Caped Crusader.
And Killer Moth.
With pleasure.
Seeing the allure of a life of crime and having ingrained most of Batman's modus operandi into his conscience, he decides to set himself up as the anti-Batman. He establishes the fake identity of millionaire philanthropist Cameron Von Clear and starts hiring himself out to Gotham City's criminals to help them elude capture by a police. Upon his release, he uses the hidden procedures of his crimes to build a criminal identity that mirrors Batman's in every way imaginable and turns him into Gotham City's Killer Moth. In his efforts to emulate Batman, he creates his own Moth-themed paraphernalia like the Moth-mobile and the Moth Cave, modeled after journalistic speculation on the Batcave's actual layout design. He'd even take on a sidekick at one point and create his own Moth signal, an infrared distress call that would only be visible to Killer Moth, allowing him to rescue his clients before they get into deeper troubles. Much like most of his Golden Age compatriots, Killer Moth languished as a D-list villain for ages, teaming up with other smaller villains like Calendar Man and Cat Man to create the meta-villain group called the Misfits. In fact, he was so so ineffective as a supervillain that after a time, Batman and Robin would leave him for the police to arrest. Unlike most, however, Killer Moth had relative longevity. Despite being considered a joke on both sides, he'd become a much more sinister character too when the demon Lord Neron transformed him into the monstrous Charaxus during the events of the Underworld Unleashed. The demon lord granted Drury Walker, that's his name by the way, his wish of being feared instead of ridiculed by everyone by transforming him into a gargantuan moth monster whose cocooning powers far exceeded those of Killer Moth's cocoon gun. As Charaxus, Killer Moth became a true monstrosity for quite a while. He could fly, had razor-sharp claws and teeth for some reason, and could capture people in cocoons made out of acid that would eventually, perform as advertised on the label. Think Breaking Bad Season 1, Episode 2, if you know, you know. Charaxus eventually goes on to lay multiple eggs that hatch Drury Walker clones, whom he hates but can't kill. Frankly, it's one of the rare times that we were happy Superboy Prime showed up to deal with something. If he hadn't ripped apart Charaxus and left him for the retcon gang to clean up later on, who knows how gross Killer Moth's story could have gotten. Or worse yet, how much more dangerous would it have been? Still, he's considered to be the relic of a bygone era by Batman himself, and is defined by his unusually elaborate yet ultimately fruitless schemes that have cemented his legacy as an underrated and unintentionally hilarious part of the Dark Knight Rogues gallery. Never change, Moth. Never change. Victor Zsasz. We at Marvelous Videos truly believe that you haven't lived if you haven't seen Anthony Carrigan play Victor Zsasz in Fox's Gotham. The man manages to make a ruthless, self-mutilating madman seem like an endearing boy next door with a passion for the disco, one-liners, pepperoni pizza, and murder. Carrigan's portrayal of the sadist mob hitman whose reputation precedes him and yet whose personality carries so much more lightness to it is pitch perfect.
No license, no crime. Now, drop the loot.
We point you to the wedding crashing scene anytime he interacted with Falcone or Penguin, and most iconic Victor Zsasz line for the TV show, "You guys got any cans of peaches?" God, I'd give an arm and a leg for that. Not mine though, someone else's. Carrigan toes the line between psychotic and endearing so perfectly that it almost makes you forget that the true Victor Zsasz is a soulless murderer whose only motivation in life is to kill, and who also happens to prefer knives to guns and slitting throats to exclaiming, "It's Christmas," when he gets an AR.
Hello, everyone. My name is Victor Zsasz.
In fact, the only thing that connects any of the mainstream portrayals of Mr. Zsasz to his true comic book persona is the fact that they mark down their kill count on their own flesh, in the form of so many tally marks. Other than that fact, they are practically different characters, and perhaps that's a good thing, because the real Victor Zsasz is too disturbing for TV. The realization that life is ultimately meaningless can do two things to a person. It can drive them to make a name for themselves so their legacy lives on beyond their mortal flesh, or it can make them so hopeless that they give into despair and eventually madness. If you ask Mr. Zsasz about it, he'll tell you that he isn't crazy, he has no dysfunctional family background, no childhood abuse or trauma, he just kills because he chooses to. Mr. Zsasz lived a privileged existence. He had a loving, wealthy family and graduated top of his class in college, later on going to amass a fortune of his own through various companies. And at age of 25, his parents tragically died in a boating accident, and while he accepted what had happened, Zsasz could not help but feel depressed at their loss. In an attempt to distract himself from his growing depression, Zsasz became swept up in high-stakes gambling and ended up losing everything to the Penguin. Dejected, he realized how hollow life is and how robotic human beings have become in their pursuit of it. Before he could commit suicide, he was attacked by a homeless person with a knife, and he saw the same hollowness within his eyes. Deciding to take out these zombies from the world in order to make it a better place, he kills that man and carves a tally mark in his own flesh, transforming into the vicious serial killer Mr. Zsasz. Victor is by no means a superhuman, being flesh and bone like the rest of us, but what makes him such a deadly threat is in fact his insanity. Mr. Zsasz will risk anything to kill anyone based on his whims. He has no pattern, no rhythm, no rhyme or reason for killing, making him practically invisible when he wasn't serving time at Arkham. He's escaped that joint multiple times too, displaying unparalleled criminal genius in the crazy head of his. Zsasz might hate guns and have a body that is indestructible in the lunatic sense, not the literal, but his true strength lies in the fact that he is schizophrenia personified and given a bunch of knives to act out with. He debuts during the last Arkham storyline as its vocal character and has sneaked up on Batman on several occasions, a feat even Catwoman fails at performing sometimes. Aside from the Joker, Zsasz is probably the only person to really get to Bruce. When he says they're in fact very similar and the Dark Knight nearly pummels him to death in a blind rage at one point. Judging by his actions, we'd say that when it comes to this murderous maniac, it's best not to trust what he says, even about himself.
But he's promised to stop that, haven't you, Mr. Stirk?
You have to get me out of here!
Cornelius Stirk. If you're the kind of Hannibal Lecter enthusiast who would love a bit of fresh heart soup dashed with Scarecrow's fear toxin for an extra kick of unholy depravity, then Cornelius Stirk is the chef you want. Because his defining trait is a combination of both of the things that we've just mentioned, and his existence still won't make proper sense to any of you. So we'll try our best to make it as simple as possible. Here goes. Cornelius Stirk has spent as many years in Arkham Asylum as he has outside of it, having been institutionalized at the age of 16 for trying to kill his classmate. Bright start. Over the course of the next 16 years, Stirk was kept heavily medicated because he had a peculiar ability. Whenever the doctors would try to retreat him, his face would transform into that of a person they loved and trusted, like a lover or a family member or a friend, or into that of a person they absolutely loathed and feared. Depending on which face you saw, he could hypnotize you into doing his bidding, thanks to the psionic powers that lie dormant in his mind. All of this made him more of a threat than any other member of Arkham, and so he was kept well medicated for most of his time there. But eventually he learned how to channel his powers and planted suggestions into his doctors' minds, convincing them to clear him as sane and get him out of that hellhole. After spending a week on the outside, Cornelius Stirk embarked on a rather unsettling journey for rather specific sorts of nutrition, which his demented brain believed was the only kind of nutrition he could truly ingest anymore. That being norepinephrine and adrenaline being released by the heart of a person who died terrified, creating an organic stew of fear, which, by the way, is just all kinds of grim. Even Scarecrow doesn't have a hard-on for fear as hard as this guy does, and he's of the Leatherface variety too, though his physical disfigurement is likely a result of the same hypothalamic abnormality that gave him his powers. If you're a regular guy and Cornelius Stirk decides to turn you into his steak dinner for the evening, there is nothing you can do about it. He will hypnotize, brutalize, and victimize you to get his way. We would like to say that Batman got lucky by capturing Stirk on his third victim, but after finding out his preferred modus operandi, it's one of those rare moments that even the necessary collateral damage will haunt you for the rest of your life, simply because you know what happened to them. We're honestly glad that Batman is able to take down this evil cannibal, thanks to his highly organized mind, because only he knows what he would have done had he been left free to roam the streets of Gotham City. And based on what he's done so far, we can safely say that it would be nothing good for them.
I said get up!
Flamingo. Eduardo Flamingo is a preening peacock of a supervillain if we've ever seen one, or rather a flamingo. One quick look at him will send you careening off to a corner grabbing your gut. After all, what kind of self-respecting hitman takes a flaming hot pink motorcycle to an assassination? Takes a dump on the entire Hitman series and community as a whole, because the first rule of being a contract killer is to hide within shadows and operate from the dark. But Flamingo is the literal opposite of that, choosing to get right up into his target's faces with submachine guns and biting off more than he can chew, and unfortunately we do mean that quite literally. For you see, though Eduardo is named after the majestic bird, there is nothing graceful about the work that Flamingo performs. Grant Morrison created him to be the Antichrist figure to Batman's Zorro, and we have to say he did a pretty good job of it. Though he debuted in the same issue as Professor Pig, which would be Batman number 666, aka Batman in Bethlehem, he would take on a more prominent role in Batman Rogues Gallery following the events of the 2009's Batman and Robin number 6. Eduardo Flamingo used to be an ordinary man with an ordinary family who used to struggle for his life and decent existence against the criminal organization known as the Mob, which was most likely the ruthless penitent cartel that operated out of Mexico. Though going was rough, to say the least. Just ask Nacho Varga how long a life opposing the cartel lasts. He managed to hold out his defiance against their operations for quite a while until they finally caught him and brainwashed him into oblivion. Subjected to intense mental programming and trauma, Eduardo was transformed into a deathly effective and deathly psychotic serial killer who, and we wish we were kidding here, dines on his victims' faces. He proceeds to nonchalantly violently kill all of his family members and then becomes a contract killer for hire for the same cartel that literally tore him apart and remade him from scratch. As the Flamingo, Eduardo gains notoriety for being exceptionally effective at his job despite being completely off his rocker. His handler, Gabriel Santo, says of Flamingo's efficiency that his kill record is impeccable. The penitent cartel was planning to get a huge shipment of drugs into Gotham so they could get the populace addicted to them and make fat profits off of the induced drug epidemic, but Red Hood foiled their plans by blowing up the shipment, which is why the Flamingo is in Gotham City. Though he has no superpowers, Flamingo's feral ferocity and expert marksmanship makes him a lethal asset for any organization, barring the garish anti-stealth pink outfits that he insists on wearing. He's skilled enough in hand-to-hand combat to stave off Batman and Robin after taking out Red Hood and Scarlet, and he didn't just take out Red Hood and Scarlet either, he systematically dismantled all 4 costume vigilantes, with Robin getting shot 5 times point blank by this madman in pink. He almost killed Jason Todd in this encounter as well, whose life was only saved by Dick Grayson's intervention as Batman. It's safe to say that had not the 4 members of the Bat family not put aside their differences and worked together to defeat the Flamingo, he might have wiped the floor with all of them at the same time, while riding his ridiculous pink motorcycle. And if that isn't a terrifyingly hilarious mental image, then we don't know what is.
It remembers everyone it touched. It's touched you, detective.
Jane Doe. You guys remember the Faceless Man from the Game of Thrones, right? That uber-mystical cult of assassins who worships a death god, charges exorbitantly high rates per kill, and somehow knows how to impersonate other people by stealing their faces. Well, take that concept and apply it to a person's entire body, and you get a rather literal skin changer, whose existence itself is a cipher by her own admission. In the context of law enforcement, the word Jane Doe is associated with a person with which the authorities cannot verifiably identify the name of. Dan Slott and Ryan Sook took this premise and created one of the most brutal female serial killers to ever grace the pages of a comic book. Debuting in Arkham Asylum, Living Hell #1, it was initially assumed that she was Dr. Ann Carver, the psychologist assigned to mob boss Warren White. It soon became clear that she was actually on the payroll of Jeremiah Arkham, the maniacal warden of Arkham Asylum who held a personal grudge against White for making him lose his pension thanks to White's corrupt business practices, and even Batman's intervention cannot stop Arkham's planted psychiatrist or his madhouse of literal freaks from making White actually go crazy, instead of simply pretending to be insane to get out of his legal troubles. During a particularly brutal riot at Arkham Asylum, Jane manages to trap White in a sub-zero cell designed to contain Mr. Freeze, plans to take on his identity to hoodwink him out of his fortune. Sadly for her, Jeremiah Arkham's quest to drive Warren White succeeds by her own hands as he emerges from the cell as the Great White Shark of Gotham City. He eventually breaks out of his imprisonment and nearly pummels Jane to death, but Doe slips through his fingers and starts pursuing her own criminal career. Jane Doe's superpower is also her greatest curse. She suffers from extremely psychological impairment to the point that she doesn't have an identity of her own and seeks to become the person she targets. To accomplish this, she has stripped off her own skin and mastered the ability to mimic a person's body language and voice down to the last syllable. When she picks a suitable target, she takes them out using her more than adequate combat skills and then wears their skin to completely subsume their identities, and she employs these skills with lethal efficiency, as was made evident during the House of Hush storyline, where she managed to maim the titular villain to the point of disfigurement in her own attempt to become Bruce Wayne, take over his multi-billion-dollar empire. To this day, no one knows Jane Doe's real name, including Batman, and he knew the Joker's real identity from the beginning, allegedly. Matilda Mathis, Dollhouse. Okay, so we can all agree that Dollmaker started out as a joke and then turned into a nightmare that we would sooner forget, right?
I'm not Anton. I am the Dollmaker.
I mean, the character started out life as a one-off Plastic Man villain, then graduated to becoming Toyman's psychotic son with, you guessed it, intense mommy issues. And then he went on to start a career in criminal insanity thanks to the New 52 reboot and the introduction of Barton Mathis, aka Dollmaker 3. Before the New 52, Dollmaker was always looked at as more of a comical reflection of Chucky with a darker side in that he used children transformed into Dollatrons who would serve his every need. Wait, that's not right. Yes, he'd turn them into living dolls that would die upon being deactivated. Sorry about the mix-up, Professor Pig. No matter how you look at things, Dollmaker was more caricature than a character for a good portion of his existence. That is, until Tony S. Daniel reimagined him as a The Hills Have Eyes inspired serial killer. And no, we're not talking about the Carters here, sad as that might be. As a child, Barton Mathis saw his own Papa Jupiter, aka Wesley Mathis, hunt and feast upon his prey during the many hunting trips they took with each other. At some point In time, he learned how to make his dolls from his spiritual father, the toy maker, and become an adept if horrifying surgeon in his own right. As the doll maker, he targeted Batman and his brethren with his own family, and that's where Dollhouse comes in. The equally, if not more, insane daughter of Barton Mathis. Mr. Mathis was not one to shy away from his family tradition, you see, grim as it was for regular humans like us, and so he took his daughter on similar trips and instilled in her the same values that Grandpa West had left him with, turning his innocent child into a feral beast fixated on creating lifelike dolls for her dollhouse by using real-life limbs from her victims. And just as an explanation point, where Barton Mathis Dollmaker can be paralleled with Leatherface in terms of his face mask, Dollhouse is somehow even more unsettling, taking her inspiration from Black Mask most likely and getting an expressionless mask of porcelain grafted onto her own face when she becomes an official member of her father's family. Dollhouse has proven herself a fierce fighter and a decent surgeon in her own right, as after her father was deceased and incarcerated, she was able to take up the reins and continue the family business of human and organ trafficking pretty much at the same level. But all this is kinda moot when you just stop and consider that this little girl attached a frigging ceramic mask to her facial skin just to prove her loyalty to her father. Now, if that doesn't spell out crazy and deadly to you guys, we don't know what does. Despite having a few appearances across DC canon, it can't be denied that Matilda Mathis, aka Dollhouse, is one of the most unsettling and uncanny residents of the Omniverse. And the less is said about her, the better it will be for all of us. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe, everyone. Thank you very much.
Don't get me wrong, that was a cool fight and all, but it was strictly C-list.
I don't play favorites. Every criminal must be brought to justice.